Imagine a Sega console that combined two consoles. Not good enough? Okay. How about a Genesis Saturn that would have been crappier? Or a Sega system so rare that only two prototypes were ever found? Sega had a lot of misfires. Those misfires and the poor strategic decisions behind them ultimately cost the company its console business. In today's video, we're going to review three of those systems that never made it off the ground: the Sega Neptune, Jupiter, and Pluto. In reviewing the canceled consoles, we will also be doing something more. Sega was the only company in the first half of the 90s that put Nintendo on their heels. But poor strategic decisions ultimately cost them their chance at fully dethroning the king. These canceled consoles will not only tell us about Sega, but they'll tell us why the company couldn't beat Nintendo. Let's start with the Sega Neptune. It's the mid 1990s, the height of the console wars. Sega is beating Nintendo back. In fact, in 1993, the Genesis sold 5.9 million units in North America, compared to a mere 4.4 million for the Super Nintendo. For the first time ever, Sega actually had a lead in the console wars. In order to continue this victory, Sega decides that the way to beat Nintendo isn't through games, but consoles. And here, it makes a strategic mistake. The 3DO and Atari Jaguar, both among the first new fifth generation of home consoles, used new technology and improved graphics to hook players. Both were backed by major electronics companies, and both showed real promise when it came to being able to enter the video game market. That left Sega with a few options, not all of which were mutually exclusive. They could continue to create high-quality Sega games and peripherals while also preparing for a new full-fledged console, or they could do something in between and design a console that was sort of a part of a new generation. Unfortunately for Sega, it chose the latter. Instead of going for a full-fledged new console and saving its considerable marketing firepower for a brand new system, as Nintendo would do with the N64, Sega does something in between. The result was codenamed Project Mars, which was eventually released as the Sega 32X, and it was a disaster for the company. The 32X was an add-on to the original Genesis that was meant to bridge the gap between 16 and 64-bit consoles. It was designed to be an extender into the Sega Saturn era. The add-on occupied a weird place in the minds of consumers. It was expensive, about $160 when first sold, but that also meant that it undercut the very expensive 3DO and Jaguar. It was an optional add-on, but it came with different cartridges, so developers had to learn how to develop for a brand new system. Consumers, unsure of what to expect with this new system, never bought in. Neither did developers. Only 40 games were ultimately developed for the new system. A mere 800,000 units were sold, and the system was ultimately a commercial failure, one that dented the reputation of Sega as a console maker. And that brings us to Project Neptune. The 32X was an add-on, one that had to be jammed kind of awkwardly into a Sega Genesis. Project Neptune was simple. It was a hybrid, with slots for both the Genesis and 32X games. Project Neptune got major buzz when Tom Kalinske, then CEO of Sega of America, first discussed the project at the 1995 Winter Consumer Electronics Show. As originally discussed, the device was set for release that year and would have cost $160, or $220 with a pack-in game. The 32X version of Virtua Fighter would have been the pack-in. Interestingly, the same Next Generation article, which discusses Project Neptune, also notes that the bigger problem for the 32X was the small library of games. Problems with the 32X plagued the release of the Neptune, with rumors of its cancellation continuing to accelerate. The launch of the Sega Saturn would ultimately push back the proposed launch of the Neptune into 1996. So, what happened? Well, Sega wised up. The Neptune would have been released around the same time as the Saturn. That console, Sega's full-fledged entry into the fifth generation of home consoles, promised revolutionary graphics, CD-based gameplay, an internet gaming service, and more. The Saturn was ultimately released in November 1994 in Japan, May 95 in North America, and July 95 in Europe. Realizing that the release would have fragmented the market and ultimately hurt their ability to sell their consoles, Sega canceled the release of the Neptune and more or less tried to move on from the disaster that was the 32X. I gotta be honest, I'm not sure what Sega was thinking here. The Saturn, the new 64-bit system, was set to be released in mid-95, but Sega was thinking about making a system that combined their 16 and 32-bit consoles. I get it, hindsight is 2020, but this scattershot approach to really critical strategic choices absolutely helps explain why Sega imploded as a console maker by the early 2000s. As for the Neptune, some prototypes were released and are available, including those that were believed to be sold by former Sega of America employee Clint Dyer. Electronic Gaming Monthly had an April Fool's joke about the system in their April 2001 edition, saying that Sega had found a warehouse of the systems and set up a website for consumers to buy it. SegaNeptune.com, of course. The 32X wasn't the only half console release by Sega during the 90s. As many of you may remember, Sega also released the Sega CD. That system, released in 1991 and 1992, did much better than the 32X, selling about 2.25 million units. The goal of the system was clear. It allowed users to play games on CDs and came with advanced hardware and processing power. It was also expensive, costing consumers as much as $300, which was actually $100 more than the price of the Super Nintendo at the time. The system was well received, although, and stop me if this sounds familiar, there were challenges for third-party studios who wanted to develop games, as Sega released development kits late. Around 200 or 210 Sega CD games were ultimately released. I mentioned this background about the Sega CD to make a point. Sega was using CDs as early as 1991, and yet, in 1994, they were seriously looking at going backwards into cartridges. Meet the Sega Jupiter. Sadly, no pictures available. This device was a Saturn, but one that was based on cartridges, not discs. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it, because one of the main appeals of the Sega Saturn was that it was a CD-based system. Work on the system started in January 1994. Sega wanted the new system to come out by Christmas of that year, slightly rushed. As designed, the Jupiter would have run with similar capabilities to the Saturn, but again, on cartridges. Articles at the time said that the system would have cost about 30,000 yen, which was lower than the 50,000 yen that the Saturn ultimately premiered at. It's unclear how much work actually took place on the Jupiter, but no prototypes were ever found. Sources indicate that the device was scrapped midway through the year for one very sensible reason. CDs were better and cheaper. More to the point, most of the industry, save for Nintendo, was moving away from cartridges. And finally, as long as we are still discussing Sega's love for planet-based projects, let's discuss the Pluto. Fast forward to 1996. The Sega Saturn, Sega's fifth-generation machine, has been released. It's doing well, but it's not capable with competing with Nintendo or Sony. That's despite the fact that the Saturn really does have some impressive capabilities. One such example is internet access. To its credit, Sega designed the Saturn so that consumers could buy a modem that could be plugged into an existing cartridge slot. That attachment, known as the Sega Netlink, was a 28.8-bit modem that would allow users to access the internet. They could then check their email or play games against others. Some games that worked for this service included Sega Rally Championship and Virtual On Cyber Troopers Netlink Edition. A centralized service, SegaNet, would be available in Japan and for the Dreamcast. And this takes us to the Pluto. The Sega Pluto looked very similar to the Sega Saturn, with one critical difference. It had a built-in modem, which would allow users access to internet-based gaming without needing to buy the upgrade. For the time, this was actually revolutionary. The Sega Dreamcast, released in 1998, was the first system to come with a built-in modem, which means that the Pluto would have actually beaten the Dreamcast to the internet. There were other aesthetic changes, and the system also would have come with significant hardware changes, but that was the main thrust of the Pluto. According to a massive leak of documents from Sega of America, the plans were for the Pluto to be sold as an upgraded device for $549. That would have made the Pluto, far and away, the most expensive console on the market at the time. The same documents also show a slew of overconfidence in Sega's performance against Sony, but we know how that went. So, here's the wild thing. All of this happened around 1997, but news of the Pluto didn't actually become public until 2013, when a user on a forum for Assembler Games, who apparently used to work with Sega, discussed the device complete with pictures. In the post, the user discussed the Pluto and revealed that there were only 2 prototypes ever made, and that he was posting pictures of device number 2. Another prototype was found at a flea market in the 1990s by a man named Roger Vega. Vega found the Pluto at a Stockton, California flea market, where he successfully negotiated the price from $5 to $1. According to reports, he only realized after reading a news story on the Pluto that what he had was a Pluto, not the Saturn. Vega tried to sell the device on GameGavel and eBay, but neither sale went through because they failed to meet the reserve price. If you're interested in watching more on the Pluto, you can check out Adam Korolick's video on the topic. Korolick was actually able to get his hands on one of the prototypes and restore it to working order. Link in the description if you're interested. The problem that Sega faced was never hardware. It always did a solid job of competing or leapfrogging the market. Rather, unfortunately, the problem was one of strategy. Sega was plagued by decisions that forced half-baked systems like the Sega CD or 32X to the market. The decision to launch these systems, rather than dig into full-fledged systems, fragmented the market, distracted brand awareness, and made it harder for Sega to compete with its competitors. The Sega Genesis seemed to be the beginning of Sega's ascent within the home console world. Instead, it proved to be its peak. Its next full-fledged consoles, the Saturn and the Dreamcast, failed to meet expectations, and their comparative failure ultimately pushed Sega from the home console market. To be clear, Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox have all had console and software failures. That's the nature of the business. However, none had anything approaching the repeated failures of Sega during this time period. These half baked strategic decisions never should have occurred, and they should have occurred with more thought. For example, Sega more or less shadow dropped the Saturn in North America in May 1995, releasing the system early in an attempt to make a marketing splash. Unfortunately for them, the system was released with an inadequate game library, and only some retailers, not all of them, actually getting Saturns. This pissed off the larger business ecosystem and did major damage to the Saturn. Arguably, this launch decision helped set the stage for the system's failure compared to other fifth generation systems. The cancel systems we discussed, though never released, provide some really remarkable insight into Sega's mindset during this time period. They seem to think that more consoles, rather than better ones, was the way to approach the market. They were wrong. And you can see that in both the consoles released and the ones held back. Ultimately, these decisions helped kill Sega's console business. As always, dear listener, I turn it over to you. Is my analysis on here? What do you think about Sega's console business? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. More importantly, if you like the video, and I certainly hope you did, please do like, subscribe, or click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you. Furthermore, if you want to support us even more, please consider becoming a channel member. By doing so, you can support the channel, get access to exclusive content, chat options, and shoutouts. As always, I want to thank Christian Village 633 for signing up as a member. Yay, Christian! Have a wonderful day out there, my friends, and hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I like making it. Take care, everybody.